What if the most famous maritime disaster in history was actually the most successful assassination in human history? On the night of April 14th, 1912, as the RMS Titanic sliced through the frigid North Atlantic waters, the ship carried more than passengers and cargo. Hidden within its luxury cabins were three of the most powerful opponents to a financial conspiracy that would reshape the global economy. By dawn on April 15th, all three men lay dead beneath 2 miles of icy water, and the path was cleared for the establishment of the Federal Reserve System that would control American monetary policy for over a century. The official story describes the Titanic's fate as a tragic accident, an unsinkable ship brought down by an iceberg and a series of unfortunate circumstances. But buried within the passenger manifest and financial records of 1912 lies evidence of something far more sinister, a carefully orchestrated elimination of the last obstacles to centralized banking control in the United States. The conspiracy begins not with the ship's construction, but with a meeting that took place 6 months before the Titanic's maiden voyage. In November 1911, a secret gathering convened at Jekyll Island, Georgia, bringing together the most powerful banking figures in America. J.P. Morgan, Paul Warburg, Nelson Aldrich, and other financial titans spent 9 days crafting legislation that would create a central banking system, giving them unprecedented control over the American economy. The Jekyll Island meeting was conducted in absolute secrecy, with participants traveling under assumed names and maintaining complete confidentiality about their discussions. They understood that their plans represented a fundamental betrayal of American democratic principles, transferring control over the nation's money supply from elected representatives to private banking interests. The legislation they crafted was designed to appear as government regulation while actually empowering private banks to control monetary policy. The Federal Reserve Act they conceived would transfer the power to create money from the U.S. government to a private consortium of banks. This system would allow a small group of financiers to manipulate interest rates, control credit flow, and profit from both economic booms and busts. It was, in essence, a plan to privatize the American monetary system and place it under the control of the world's wealthiest banking families. The elegance of their scheme lay in its public presentation as financial reform rather than private takeover. By calling their creation the Federal Reserve, they implied government ownership and control when in reality the system would be owned and operated by private banks for their own benefit. The regional Federal Reserve banks would be privately owned corporations, their board members selected by commercial banks rather than elected officials. More significantly, the Jekyll Island conspirators designed their system to operate with minimal government oversight or public accountability. Federal Reserve meetings would be conducted in secret, their decisions implemented without congressional approval, and their profits distributed to member banks rather than the U.S. Treasury. This structure would give private banking interests more control over American economic policy than the President or Congress. But the Jekyll Island conspirators faced a significant obstacle. 3 immensely wealthy and influential opponents who possessed both the resources and the determination to prevent their plan from becoming law. Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to a mining and smelting fortune, Isidore. Straus, owner of Mace's department store, and a former congressman in John Jacob. Astor IV, the richest man in America, had all publicly opposed the creation of a central bank and were actively working to prevent its establishment. These 3 men represented more than just wealth. They embodied an alternative vision of American capitalism that threatened the monopolistic ambitions of the Jekyll Island Group. Guggenheim controlled vast mining operations that could provide the gold backing for an independent monetary system. His companies extracted precious metals from operations across the American West, giving him the physical resources necessary to challenge paper currency manipulation. He had repeatedly stated that America's monetary system should be based on tangible assets rather than the promises of private bankers. Straus had extensive political connections and had served in Congress, giving him insight into legislative processes and the ability to mobilize opposition to central banking legislation. As a former House representative, He understood the constitutional issues surrounding monetary policy and had been drafting alternative legislation that would have placed currency creation under direct treasury control. His retail empire also gave him influence over public opinion, as Macy's was one of America's most trusted commercial brands. Astor possessed not only enormous wealth, but also significant influence over public opinion through his investments in newspapers and real estate. His fortune, estimated at over $150 million in $1,912, made him one of the wealthiest individuals in human history. More importantly, Astor had been using his resources to investigate and expose what he called the money power conspiracy that was attempting to gain control over American finance. More importantly, all three men had been investigating the Jekyll Island meeting and were preparing to expose the central banking conspiracy to the American public. Private correspondence recovered decades later revealed that Guggenheim had hired investigators to document the connections between European central banks and American financiers. His detectives had discovered evidence linking the Jekyll Island group to the Rothschild banking network and other international financial interests that sought to control American monetary policy. Straus was drafting legislation that would have made private central banking illegal in the United States. His proposed bill would have required all currency creation to be conducted by the Treasury Department under direct congressional oversight, preventing the privatization of monetary policy that the Jekyll Island group was planning. The legislation was scheduled for introduction in early 1913, potentially derailing the Federal Reserve Act before it could be implemented. Astor was reportedly planning to use his media holdings to launch a public campaign against what he called the Money Trust. He had commissioned journalists to investigate the Jekyll Island meeting and was preparing exposed articles that would reveal the private banking conspiracy to the American public. His plan included a series of newspaper articles, public speeches, and congressional testimony that would have made the central banking scheme politically impossible to implement. The timing of the Titanic's maiden voyage created an unprecedented opportunity. All three men would be traveling together on the same ship, along with their key advisors and allies. If something were to happen to the vessel, the opposition to central banking would be eliminated in a single stroke, and the tragedy could be blamed on unfortunate circumstances rather than deliberate action. J.P. Morgan himself had been scheduled to sail on the Titanic's maiden voyage, having booked one of the ship's most luxurious suites months in advance. His presence on the ship would have been natural given his involvement with International Mercantile Marine Company, which owned the White Star Line. However, just days before departure, Morgan suddenly canceled his passage, claiming illness. This last-minute cancellation saved his life and positioned him to benefit from the elimination of his opponents. The cancellation itself raises disturbing questions about Morgan's knowledge of the ship's fate. Contemporary accounts describe Morgan as appearing healthy and active in the days following the Titanic's sinking, suggesting that his illness was either fabricated or conveniently timed. Witnesses reported seeing Morgan at his usual business meetings and social functions throughout the week of the disaster, showing no signs of the serious illness that supposedly prevented his travel. More significantly, Morgan was not the only member of the banking elite to cancel passage at the last moment. Several other figures connected to the Jekyll Island group also withdrew from the voyage, citing various personal emergencies. Paul Warburg canceled his family's reservations, claiming unexpected business complications. Henry Clay Frick withdrew from the passenger list due to what his secretary described as urgent financial matters that required his immediate attention in New York. The pattern of cancellations among Jekyll Island participants cannot be dismissed as coincidence. These men had booked their passages months in advance, making elaborate plans for what was supposed to be the social event of the decade. Their simultaneous withdrawal from the voyage suggests coordination and advanced knowledge of the ship's planned destruction. The timing ensured that the conspiracy's architects would survive while their opponents perished. But Morgan's cancellation was just one element in a pattern of suspicious circumstances surrounding the Titanic's final voyage. The ship's route had been mysteriously altered just days before departure, taking it through an area known for increased iceberg activity. The decision to maintain high speed despite ice warnings violated standard maritime safety protocols that had been established after previous North Atlantic disasters. Even more disturbing, the Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic, had suffered significant damage in a collision with HMS Hawke just months earlier. Some researchers have suggested that the two ships were deliberately switched, with the damaged Olympic sailing under Titanic's name while carrying inadequate lifeboats and safety equipment. This theory would explain why the unsinkable Titanic went down so quickly and why so many basic safety protocols were ignored. The iceberg collision itself presents anomalies that challenge the official narrative. Multiple witnesses reported that the impact seemed insufficient to cause the catastrophic damage that sank the ship. Some survivors described hearing explosions from within the ship that couldn't be explained by collision damage alone. The pattern of hull breaches discovered during deep-sea exploration suggests damage consistent with internal explosions rather than scraping against ice. Contemporary maritime experts who examined the wreckage noted that the steel plates showed evidence of explosive forces working from inside the ship outward, not the crushing impact expected from an iceberg collision. However, these findings were quickly suppressed, and investigators were discouraged from pursuing further analysis. The behavior of the ship's crew during the evacuation also suggests knowledge of the ship's planned destruction. The loading of lifeboats was deliberately inefficient, with many boats launched at partial capacity despite having time and space for additional passengers. Priority was consistently given to first-class passengers, ensuring that the wealthy opponents of central banking had no chance of survival while preserving the lives of those who supported the financial conspiracy. Captain Edward Smith's actions during the crisis were particularly suspicious. Rather than following standard emergency procedures, Smith seemed resigned to the ship's fate and made decisions that ensured maximum casualties. Some survivors reported that Smith appeared to be following predetermined instructions rather than responding to an unexpected emergency. In the aftermath of the disaster, the investigation into the sinking was conducted with unusual speed and limited scope. Key witnesses were not called to testify, crucial evidence was deemed inadmissible, and alternative explanations for the sinking were quickly dismissed. The official inquiry concluded within months, a remarkably short time frame for such a significant disaster, and its findings aligned perfectly with the interests of those who would benefit from the victims' deaths. The political consequences of the Titanic disaster were immediate and dramatic. With Guggenheim, Straus, and Astor eliminated, the primary opposition to central banking collapsed completely. Within 18 months of the sinking, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act, establishing the private central banking system that the Jekyll Island conspirators had designed. The legislation sailed through Congress with minimal opposition, as the wealthy voices that might have funded resistance campaigns had been permanently silenced beneath the Atlantic. J.P. Morgan, who had avoided death by canceling his passage, emerged from the Titanic disaster with unprecedented financial power. His banking empire expanded rapidly in the years immediately following 1912, and he became one of the primary architects of the Federal Reserve System. The convenient elimination of his opponents allowed Morgan to consolidate control over American finance in ways that would have been impossible if Guggenheim, Straus, and Astor had lived to continue their resistance. The establishment of the Federal Reserve represented the culmination of decades of persistent effort by international banking families to gain control over the American monetary system. The system they created allowed private banks to issue currency, control interest rates, and manipulate economic cycles for their own benefit. This concentration of financial power in private hands represented a fundamental shift in the American economic system, transferring sovereignty over money from elected government to unelected bankers. The long-term consequences of this shift have shaped every major economic event of the past century. The Great Depression, World War financing, inflation cycles, and modern economic crises can all be traced to decisions made by Federal Reserve officials operating in the interests of private banking cartels rather than the public good. The system established in the wake of the Titanic disaster gave a small group of financiers the power to create booms and busts, enriching themselves while impoverishing entire nations. Modern analysis of the Federal Reserve's operations reveals disturbing patterns of market manipulation and wealth concentration that validate the concerns expressed by the Titanic's wealthy victims. The system has consistently transferred wealth from ordinary citizens to banking elites through inflation, debt creation, and artificial economic cycles. The fears that motivated Guggenheim, Straus, and Astor to oppose central banking have been proven correct by over a century of evidence. The suppression of information about the Titanic conspiracy continues to this very day. Maritime historians who question the official narrative face professional ostracism and funding difficulties. Archaeological expeditions to the wreck are strictly controlled, preventing independent analysis of evidence that might contradict the accident theory. Key documents from the period remain classified or mysteriously unavailable to researchers. Media coverage of the Titanic consistently reinforces the romance and tragedy of the official story while completely ignoring questions about financial motives and suspicious circumstances. The focus on individual heroism and love stories deflects attention from the systematic elimination of central banking opponents and its political consequences. This narrative control ensures that the public continues to view the disaster as a tragic accident rather than a successful assassination. The Titanic disaster represents much more than just the loss of life. It marks the moment when democratic control over monetary policy was surrendered to private banking interests. The ship that sank in the North Atlantic carried not just passengers, but the last hope for an American financial system that served the public rather than private profit. When those waters closed over the heads of Guggenheim, Straus, and Astor, they also closed over a century of American monetary independence. Today, as we all struggle with economic inequality, debt crises, and financial instability, we're reliving with the consequences of decisions made in the aftermath of that frigid April night in 1912. The Federal Reserve System that rose from the Titanic's wreckage has created exactly the kind of financial tyranny that its victims died trying to prevent. Their warnings about the dangers of centralized banking have proven prophetic, but their voices were silenced before they could prevent the catastrophe they foresaw. What if the greatest tragedy of the Titanic wasn't the loss of the ship, but the loss of American financial freedom? What if the iceberg was just a convenient excuse for the most successful political assassination in modern history? And what if the real treasure lying on the ocean floor isn't gold and jewelry, but the evidence of the conspiracy that changed the world? The answers may be buried 2 miles beneath the North Atlantic, along with the men who died defending a financial system that served humanity rather than enslaving it. Ready to expose the secret knowledge they've kept from humanity for millennia? Determined to destroy the lies we've been spoon-fed about our true past? Then become part of this resistance network. Hit that subscribe button hard, record everything you uncover, and let's track down these hidden realities together. The evidence stays locked behind barriers of lies and institutional control. But together, as investigators, we possess the strength to expose their most guarded mysteries to the world.